Okay, in the topic of gene pool, one of the terms that they talk about is called population. And when they talk about population, we could talk about the population of each separate organism. And so if you have a group of individuals of the same species that are living in the same area, an example, we could say mountain lions, cougar, panthers, all the other names that it goes by, that live, for instance, in our area. So that would make up the population of mountain lions in our area. So this is talking about all the different kind of dogs that we probably find all around the earth. If we were to take from that all the different genes that all the dogs could possibly have, let's say for height would be all the genes that have to do with height, or all the genes that have to do with, let's say, hair color, texture, any particular trait, all the possible alleles, all the possible different variations of that make up what's called the gene pool for that trait. The gene pool for that trait. So all the members, all the dogs do not possess all the alleles. I can't cross any two dogs and get a Saint Bernard. I can't cross any two dogs and get a Chihuahua or whatever dog that we're talking about. But if I look at all the different kind of dogs and all the different alleles they have for a particular characteristic, that makes up the gene pool. So here in this diagram, the larger circle would represent sort of like our gene pool. But then we have within that certain breeds of dogs that have maybe a more limited set of characteristics for that kind of dog. So, for instance, we don't, I'm just trying to think of a dog, we don't find certain characteristics with certain kinds of dogs. Like one of the biggest dogs that I see in our area is the big white Pyrenees. They're stand up about that high, have really long white hair, kind of lumber along. There's just a big dog. There's one that walks by our houses. But you probably don't find certain traits. I don't think their tail curls, does it? I don't think it does. But some dogs have real curly tails. That's just characteristic of that. So the genes for what happens to the tail. Does the tail just hang straight down? Does it maybe stick out more straight? Does it look? Is it curled? All those would be different alleles for tail shape or whatever you want to call it. But so those are all the different kinds. Now, as you get smaller groups, then you would have like a smaller population. Like all the dogs that are, like German Shepherds. Now, originally the German Shepherds obviously came from, or bred, or selected for Germany, right? And they like them for they're real smart. They can be used, the size helps them to make good guard dogs and things like that. But there's the characteristics that we wanted. So we have populations would be all the individuals that are in an area. As far as humans are concerned, if you trace back to the Tower of Babel, when God confounded the languages, remember they were wanting to, let's not spread out, let's build a tower so that we can make a name for ourselves and stick together. That was the opposite of the instructions that God had given them. He said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In other words, don't just settle in one area, spread out. Is what God wanted, and they didn't want to do it, so he figured the way to do that would be just don't let different families be able to communicate with other languages or other families because they had a different language. They moved out. As they moved out, they would take with them from this larger gene pool that all humans have. They're going to take a small, like a subset of that. You know, like we talked about in math, subsets out from a larger set. They would have their subset of characteristics. So you go to certain parts of the world, you find different nationalities. Why? Because they have a different subset of the alleles that are all part of the gene pool. You know, you can marry somebody from any country in the world and have children. Now, if they're from a different country than you are, they're introducing some alleles into your family's gene pool that you didn't have possibly. You know, like maybe colors of eyes. Like when our son was born, was the first grandson that didn't have blue eyes, or the first grandchild that didn't have blue eyes. Everybody else all the grandkids had blue eyes, and a lot of them had blonde hair as well. He has brown hair and brown eyes. So I brought in some genes that family didn't have in their particular gene pool. Yes, it was part of the human's gene pool, that eye color. Now, my eyes are green, and my wife's are green, but we have a son who has brown eyes. In other words, we had some genes in there for brown. Now, when it comes to genetic variations, I think some of these, a question you might come up with, is the gene pool that humans have today exactly the same gene pool that Adam and Eve had back then? And I'm probably going to say no. And the reason for that, I think there's some characteristics that maybe came about as either the result of the curse. God may have added some extra alleles into the gene pool, or these are as a result of mutations in some of the genes. So when you have a mutation, you're adding an extra allele into the gene pool. That's possible. Remember, these are all represent possibilities of genes for that particular characteristic. So hemophilia, your inability for your blood to clot properly, would be probably one of those alleles. But it says the genotypic, that means the actual genes that you have, difference between the individuals, that actually are coming from the same gene pool. Your connection to the overall gene pool are your parents. Your parents gave you some of the genes from that gene pool. Your mom did, your dad did, and now you have that, that portion, that subset of the genes in this overall gene pool. Now, if everybody on Earth wasn't prejudiced, was free to marry anybody that they wanted to without there being any social stigma or anything like that, what we would look like after many generations, we'd still probably see quite a bit of variety, but not necessarily we wouldn't have to go to necessarily a different country to see the variety. It would all be within our families. We would have this. And what would we possibly look like? I'm guessing, maybe, most of you know who Elise is? Yeah, Elise was born in Israel. She actually was born in Bethlehem. Nazareth. She's born in Nazareth, sorry. She's born in Nazareth, so she's Palestinian, and which is kind of in between color-wise, isn't it? It's not light, it's not dark, kind of in between. That's probably what Adam and Eve were like, That was their, but Adam and Eve carried with them the entire gene pool. All the genes, possibilities must have been inside of them, and then as so many of these characteristics are created or produced by multiple sets of pairs of genes working together, You know, we actually found out that the human ear is really controlled possibly by as many as 49 different pairs that produce the overall shape of the ear. Well, you know, if that's that many different possibilities, you can think of that's the reason why we look around this room, why we have quite the variety of way people look. We have some with darker skin, some with pretty light skin, some with dark hair, some with pretty light hair, some with dark eyes, some with blue eyes. You know, you just have all the variety. But I think you'd see a lot more like different possibilities than if everybody just marries within a small group. You know, you have a pretty limited, you know, your gene pool is a lot more limited, and certain characteristics you just don't see. Now, it could be also on a negative part that we know that certain negative, what I mean by negative is characteristics that are kind of like detrimental, that certain nationalities tend to have those characteristics, some of those, then others don't have it at all. Like, for instance, sickle cell anemia is like the African American community often has those. Now, that is in itself considered kind of a negative trait to have, because you have anemia. But it also can be somewhat an advantage if you lived in another part of the world where you were having to deal with malaria. People that have sickle cell anemia are less likely to get malaria. So there's an advantage. So something that's a negative in one situation actually can turn out to be somewhat of a positive in a different set of conditions, different environment. Now, mass selection is where we take animals and plants and we select for certain characteristics that we like. Now, sometimes, well, like for instance, let's take roses as an example. I mean, most of us know what a rose looks like, and we like that really tight bunch of petals that they have, and then when they open up, it looks very beautiful. But the wild rose doesn't look anything like that. It just has one single row of petals around the outside, pretty plain, kind of like what some of the roses that some of you might have, they're called shrub roses. They look more similar to what a wild rose would look like. So we have selected roses that have the desired characteristics and then have bred those with others with similar characteristics, trying to enhance a particular trait that we like. That's probably all the different breeds of animals were like that. There was something they liked about that dog, for instance, and they bred, only allowed or were after those of a certain trait. So that's the reason why when we talk about like a Saint Bernard, it looks a certain way because they selected for those traits. So crossing one thing with another, this idea of crossbreeding individuals, whether they're animal or plant, they've done this for thousands of years. In fact, there's a story in the Old Testament where, remember, Jacob steals his brother's birthright, and in the process of all of that, his brother gets so angry with him he wants to kill him. And so their mother, Rebecca, says, why don't you just run away to my brother Laban? That would be Jacob's uncle, Laban, and he starts working for him, finds him and works for him, falls in love with his daughter, which would be his cousin, and he works for 7 years. And now Jacob, his name means surplanter or deceiver. That's what it. Can you imagine having a name like that, of a deceiver? Well, guess who he works for? Laban, who's another deceiver. He says, you can marry Rachel if you work for me 7 years. And then he doesn't give him Rachel, he gives him Leah instead. You know, so one deceiver working for another deceiver, that doesn't really turn out well. But in the process of all of this, you know, working for ultimately to get Rachel as his wife, he wants to have his herds of his own. And that was one of the things he did for his uncle, was that he raised cattle. And so he wanted one of his own. So his uncle, being a deceiver, said, well, why don't you give me all the animals of this color, and you take the animals of this color. Well, it turns out the animal color that he was after is the dominant trait. So remember, that's going to show up most often, right? Typically. Not always, but typically. And he gave Jacob the one that had the recessive trait. So there weren't going to be all that many of it. So he thought, you know, his herds will never grow all that big. And Jacob, also still being this deceiver, had figured out, raising these cattle for all these years, you know, if I control which animals get to mate, I can control what the color is that's going to be born. And so that's exactly what he does. He goes out there and controls what animals can mate. And guesses, he understood it enough that if I take this color with this color, it's going to more likely have animals of my color that I want. So his herd started growing in size, and his uncle's didn't. Well, his uncle realizes he's been deceived, and so that's kind of like the beginning of the end. That's what actually causes them to have to separate from each other. And Jacob says, you know, I'm going to go back home where I came from, and hopefully my brother will not be as angry as he was before, and in fact he wants to give him all kinds of gifts to appease him. But the story is that, you know, that he was using crossbreeding traits, that desirable traits that he was after. Now, when it comes to corn here in our area, that is very important for people who raise corn to be able to produce as many bushels per acre as they do. If you've read in the book, the original corn that they were growing on a farm originally put out about 60 bushels per acre. Not all that much. I remember barely when my dad lived on a farm in western Nebraska. This would be dry land farming. There wasn't any irrigation. That he, didn't have a combine that picked corn. He went around by hand, had the special glove on that had a little knife on down here, as I recall, and he would grab a hold of the ear of corn, and then with, I don't know if it's wrist, something like this, its knife would slash the part where the ear of corn is hooked onto the stalk, and then he'd throw it into the trailer that my mother was pulling through the field. So he harvested all his fields by hand. And then it wasn't even shelled on top of it all. Now combines pick the ear and then they shell it and throw the cobs out the back and dump the yellow grain into the grain carts now anymore. They use those grain carts to take that grain to the semi, and then they haul it to the elevator or to their farm to store it. But that production today, if you read in the book, they've got yields that are over 200 bushels per acre, going from 60 up to that. And how do they do that? That by crossbreeding two genetically unrelated individuals, two genetically unrelated varieties of corn, and they produce a hybrid. And to keep this on doing that, to multiply their seed like that, some people your age will go out and work in the fields detasseling. Ever heard of people being on a detasseling crew? They pay pretty good. It's hard work, but they pay really quite good. But it's only for, I forget how many weeks, the job is only for that week, for that long, just when the tassels are So they'll detassel, which means they'll pull those off. So that pollen on there can't fertilize the corn silk, you know, the part that sticks out of the ear of corn. That's where the pollen grain falls on there and fertilizes. Every kernel of corn has to be fertilized separately. But by crossbreeding that, you end up with superior characteristics. It's now producing 200 bushels to the acre, probably more than that. And also the corn, the original corn was only about this tall. The original corn, you know, like that Indians grew and things like that, was really short. But it was dry land. I mean, I guess they would water some if they would want to haul water. They could water it individually. But now the corn is, I mean, you have to almost reach up to get just to the ear of corn. There's a lot of corn stalk above that. So even though it has a desirable characteristic of a big, much bigger ear of corn, you know, now the ear of corn is probably about this big around. The original one from the small variety was probably only about that big around. You know, just really tiny. If you've ever seen Indian corn, it's kind of like that. Really small corn cobs, not all that many kernels on each cob. But by doing this, you know, you have this bigger one. But the downside on it, what do really tall corn stalks typically happen to do, especially during storms? They want to lay down, right? Well, it's kind of hard to harvest stuff when it's laying on the ground. So what they do to keep the corn stalk from tipping over after it gets up to a certain height. Now, corn stalk, as we'll learn in the chapter about plants, has what they call prop roots, little roots that come up above ground and go into the ground that help to brace the corn stalk. But what they will do after the corn is probably, maybe knee-high to waist-high, somewhere in there, they'll run a tractor through the field with an implement that's called a lister. It has little round blades on it, and it pushes dirt up against the rows of corn. If you've ever looked down the rows, you notice that it goes up like this and then down and up like this and down. Well, when they planted it, it was all flat. So they're moving that dirt up against the stalk of the plants so they help support it. And, you know, other corn stalks around it help to, yeah, you guys can go, help to support it so that it won't fall, not, you know, get tipped over in a storm. So this hybrid characteristic is called heterosis or hybrid vigor. Like when you hybridize something, it often has superior characteristics to either parent. In other words, maybe produces more bushels per acre than either of them will. Now, inbreeding, what does that mean?
That's where two things are like the same breed, you like breeding together, like you know what a purebred dog is? I used to have a purebred beagle, so like.
Okay, I mean the name kind of sounds like that's what it is, but it's even more than just that.
Okay.
It means mating with a close relative.
That's kind of weird.
So that would be like if you have a litter of puppies that has males and females, and they are mating with their litter mates. Now, what do you think potentially could potentially happen here? What's kind of a negative possibly with that?
Can there be like deformities or something like that?
Yeah, because even though most of these things like that deformities are parts of traits that are recessive, usually have a good gene, you know, what your other gene is a good one, and it covers it up and you never see it. But if you your siblings, your litter mates are more likely to have those same traits. And when they have puppies, some of those are going to have the homozygous recessive combo that of this undesirable trait. Now, one of my first learning about this is when my dad, when I was ready for a kindergarten, my dad moved to Omaha and went to Grace to become a preacher, pastor. And while we lived in Omaha, we lived only a couple blocks from Grace, and at 9th and Hickory, if you know that area at all, 9th and Hickory. And there was a lady on Hickory that had a great big house. She was, as I recall, was like a widow lady, I think. And she had cats, lots of cats. And there was always cats running everywhere in her yard and in and out of the house and stuff like that. And I'm just, one of my memories, distinct memories, is when we lived there, since our backyard and her backyard, our backyard went one way and her backyard touched, you know. So her cats would be, and they typically would fight with each other, and it seems like at night because they were more likely to fight. And they'd have these cat fights right underneath our windows. Well, my dad graduates, we moved to Montana, and I think my parents, for a while, you know, had been getting the Omaha World Herald before they moved, and they just had it forwarded to Montana. And I remember seeing an article in there where the lady that lived in that house had passed away. So they had, you know, come to clean the house out and stuff like that. And when they got there, they found out there were lots of cats. As I recall, I think she had over 90 cats. But because those cats were inbreeding with them, there were a large number of cats that were deformed. You know, some had big heads, all kinds of different things that you could possibly imagine could happen with them mating, you know, siblings mating with each other, possibly the parents mating with the siblings, you know, all kind of combinations like that. And so that's what inbreeding can be, but with plants it's not necessarily a bad thing, it turns out. With plants we can get often the desirable characteristics that we're after. Now, if we, you know, as I talked about before, if the gene pool is much what it was like for Adam and Eve, you know, the gene pool that they have is pretty much what we have today, but there could possibly be some genes that some families had, you know, that when God confounded the language, had certain alleles that only their family happened to have. And let's say they moved to an area and maybe for whatever circumstances may have wiped out their entire population, then their alleles would be missing now, right, from the gene pool. But we can also have mutations that can add new alleles from time to time. Now, when I see some of these, what we would classify as negative alleles, you know, alleles that produce characteristics or that maybe where we're not as healthy, like hemophilia or something like that. The question in my mind is, I don't know if they happen by a mutation, entirely possible, or when God placed His curse on all His creation, did He just happen to add these alleles to the gene pool? You know, part of the curse. I don't know. You know, there's nothing in the Bible that says one way or the other. And, you know, you could take either line of reasoning and probably never be sure. How did these alleles, these negative ones, I'm sure Adam and Eve didn't have them, you know, because God made them perfect. Said that everything was very good. So I don't think they had them. But did they come about through mutations that have accumulated over time, which add to the alleles? Or did God just place them in there as the consequences of wanting to live without him? So selective breeding probably just rearranges this information. You know, we have certain breeds of cats, dogs, cattle. Now, one of the downsides of selective breeding, when we typically take cattle, we have a lot of ranchers that are out probably more towards western part of our state that grow a lot of raise a lot of cattle. But when we, if we're going to raise beef cattle, we're going to want ones that probably don't have a lot of fat in the meat. Things that we would classify as healthy beef. But so we have cattle like Black Angus, we have the Herefords for meat, then we have cows that are really good at producing milk, like the Guernseys and the Jerseys, which came ultimately from England. Those names come from there. But would any of those animals survive well in the wild on their own? So when we choose certain characteristics, we're often selecting against some, not by choice, but will also happen to be selecting against certain traits that would make them able to survive on their own without human intervention. So, now, some of the animals obviously were not selected enough because like we have wild horses and wild donkeys and stuff like that. So some of them still had enough of the desirable characteristics to be able to live in the wild on their own. But, I mean, there's a lot of animals that we have, they would live well on their own. Pigs, I think, what is it, down in Arkansas, Missouri, they have, wild pigs. And a lot of these wild pigs are actually, they call them feral pigs. They're actually domesticated pigs that got loose, and now are living out in the wild and mating and having their own little pigs, little piglets. Okay? So genetic change doesn't automatically lead to evolution. It doesn't make a whole new species of animals or a different kind of animals. Okay, now the other topic that we wanted to talk about is eugenics. Eugenics means by itself of good origins or well-born. And these are efforts to improve the human gene pool. And people have been doing this for, probably generations. There is one, I don't know if you read this in your book, there's one of our presidents that has some ideas. If you were to suggest this today, he wouldn't be very popular for that reason. He believed that people with negative traits should be sterilized and not allowed to have children. This is Theodore Roosevelt, by the way, who I'm talking about, who's a very famous president, did a lot of good things, but he had some really what I call wacky ideas. Now, did we in our country ever do anything like that? Yeah, there was a period of time when if you were mentally insane or something like that, they would sterilize all the people who were mentally insane so they couldn't have children. Or certain criminals were sterilized so that they couldn't have children. We think of that, the only people that have ever done this was Hitler when he tried to exterminate the Jews. The Jews. The Jews and the Gypsies were an inferior race. Are they a different race than we? How many races are there of humans? One. We're all the same one. Okay? We have a lot, just like we had a picture of all those different dogs. Are they still dogs? Yes, they're all dogs. And so, but did it stop at World War II? I don't know if you've been paying any attention to, you know, the current events that are happening right now. President Trump is removing some of our troops that we're using in Syria, and so now that Turkey is trying to chase out all the Kurds who helped us fight against ISIS, but they're chasing all those out of northern Syria. It's a form of what have you ever heard the term ethnic cleansing, where we're trying to get rid of a certain group of people? When you were younger, maybe even before you were born, that kind of thing happened in Europe, where they had some countries that were totally trying to wipe out a certain part of their population that were a different nationality than they were. And so they were trying to ethnically cleanse, in other words, trying to clean up our gene pool, not to allow certain individuals with certain traits, in other words, certain nationalities, to have children. But typically it's usually coupled with racism and prejudice. I mean, whether you think you're racist or prejudiced or not, in reality, we probably all are, at least to some degree, some to a lot greater degree. Here's how you can tell if you are racist or prejudiced, is would you consider marrying somebody from the opposite sex from any nationality?